Thanks for joining us today. Feel free to eat like the rest of us.
So usually, do we get to do a round of introductions? I mean, if there are only a handful of us, it'd be nice to get to know everybody.
Yes, that last week, that is what Professor Deitch did, and I think it really helped kind of make it a better conversation. So yeah, absolutely.
Awesome.
Well, I'm sure friends will continue to pop in and join us, but students, thanks so much for joining us today, and we'll give a special thank you to Dr. Erin Lentz for sharing her lunch hour with us. But we'll just let you take it away. Let's we'll follow your lead, Dr. Lentz.
All right, great. Well, so this is totally unscripted. If you feel comfortable, if you're eating lunch, you're more than welcome to do that on Zoom. I actually don't find it offensive when people eat on Zoom, even though some people do. So I'd much rather see people than see just kind of blank screens. So with that, I think what I'd love to do would be to just go around and everybody introduce themselves, and I can give you guys a spiel. I did, I guess, this was like 2 Camp LBJs ago, or kind of orientation weeks, and talking a little bit about like what I think about when I'm thinking about development stuff as a career, if that's helpful. But why don't we do introductions first? And I would love to know obviously your name, where you are in the program, and what you're thinking about in terms of development. That's a big, broad question, but either are you thinking about it as possible internships, or are you thinking about it as a general interest, or are you thinking about it as a career trajectory? That would all be really helpful to know. So yeah, I can start. I'm Erin. I have been working in the development/humanitarian space for, over 15 years. I started out working on food aid and food assistance, and that's kind of taken a bunch of different directions. Some of it is thinking about gender and nutrition and agriculture. Others of it is thinking about how to identify when food aid makes sense, which is called like response analysis. And some of it is around some of the challenges around early warning systems for humanitarian interventions. So how do we identify when something's going wrong, and where, and who to target, and what kind of resources make the most sense? So that's some of the research areas I've been involved in more recently, and I'm happy to talk about other things too. In terms of my development kind of background in terms of career stuff, I used to work for CARE, which is a really large non-governmental organization in the US. I didn't last long. I was there for less than a year, and I can talk a little bit about why. But I'd love to hear from you all first. And so I'm just going to call on people as the way they show up in my screen. I realize that might not be the way they show up in your screen. So Rachel, if you're not, if you're there, I would love to hear a little bit about what you're up to and how you're thinking about development stuff. Oh, Rachel, I know, Rachel, you're the wrong Rachel. Tell me, Rachel.
Well, I'd have to think about it a little bit more.
My apologies. All right, well, maybe we'll just jump to Nina then.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My name is Nina, and I'm originally from Japan. I just moved here 3 months ago, so I'm still getting used to Austin. And my program is MGPS. And I'm very interested in looking into the correlation between food insecurity and violent conflict. So I'm having a portfolio program. I'm taking portfolio program in security studies at the Clement Center. And yeah, I'm interested into getting to know more about your research and about your interest. Nice to meet you.
It's nice to meet you too. Welcome. And Sherry, you're next up on my list.
Right. Hello there. So my name is Sherry. You got it right. Congrats. Most people usually struggle. But I'm a dual degree student in public health and public affairs. And so my interest, I actually don't have any sort of developmental interests. I joined this conversation because I had a specific question for you, because I know you got your PhD in sociology, so I want to ask a little bit about that. But I'll do that after introductions.
Great.
But most of my interests lie in health policy in regards to mental health policy and opioid policy. So that's a little bit about me. But I'll be doing my LBJ coursework next year.
Got it. So are you doing your first year of public health work now? Gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And so folks who don't know, I feel like the public health folks, or you guys have like very like sequential coursework, whereas sometimes the dual degree folks are like around a little bit, but like half their classes, whereas you guys like appear and disappear a little bit more.
Yeah, it's definitely the case. We're kind of all over the place sometimes, and with the dual degree, it's quite structured, and there is a little bit of flexibility on both ends, but it's for the most part kind of set in stone what you're going to do.
Yeah. Well, welcome. It's nice to meet you. I don't think we've gotten to meet yet before. And then John, yeah, I was gonna say you've got a ton of experience for us to draw on. So please, yeah, give yourself an introduction.
No, okay, well, yeah, Dr. Lentz, my interests in food and development, and coming from a background where I did the Peace Corps, West Africa, and in food security projects specifically. I think I'm really interested in all of your work in connection with critical lens on development, a critical look at sort of the North-South development structures and imagining what could be next for a lot of people in developing countries, and a path towards economic justice. So. Oh, and I interned with CRS last summer, which was an internship I found through an email that went out through one of your connections, Dr. Lentz. So.
And for folks who don't know, CRS is Catholic Relief Services, and so they're one of the other kind of big non-governmental organizations in the U.S. Or with headquarters in the U.S. or I guess national quarters, maybe. Olivia, how about you? Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Olivia. I'm a second-year GPS student specializing in international development. Broadly, I'm interested in gender, economic development, and I want to go into monitoring and evaluation.
Great, welcome. All right, and Raymond, always a pleasure.
Hey, thank you, Dr. Lentz. That's so kind of you. I'm Raymond, a second-year MPAP student, and my interests mostly, generally, personally focus on security forces in various formats and how governments use those in relation to all of these other things that we're talking about. So lately, I've been really interested in how governments use their security forces to enforce their immigration policies. And then I've worked on some good governance stuff. For 2 years, I worked for the Open Government Partnership, doing both local evaluations here in Austin and also supporting evaluations in a variety of countries around the world. And I am also a lifelong member of Innovations for Peace and Development at LBJ. I was a founding researcher as an undergrad, and I am now privileged to serve as the program manager for that organization. And I'm just here to learn as much as possible, just like I do in your class every week. So thanks for having me.
Well, before I let you stop talking, just so folks who maybe aren't aware, can you tell everybody a little bit about what IPD is?
Yeah, so IPD is I feel like I should be good at this point, I'm still stumble through it, but we're a cross-disciplinary research organization that started in 2013 with a tiny bit of funding from USAID, and over 7 years has focused on everything from climate change to conflict and development to public health. We've just launched this year a new team called Reimagining Safety and Security that looks into some issues around policing and migration and national security. And, usually trying to focus around the SDGs, but throughout the years, that's kind of ebbed and flowed, sometimes depending on who's funding particular projects, and which I guess is a microcosm of the development space. And yeah, so IPD, it's open to all students at UT. Our teams are made up of undergraduates and graduates. We have undergraduates leading some of our teams, really cool stuff. And we have faculty affiliates like Dr. Lentz who are adjacently associated at times. And then we have 3 faculty directors who come from the government school and from LBJ as well. So it's Dr. Weaver and then 2 professors from the government department. And I'm always happy to answer questions about that program if anybody ever wants to reach out.
And it seems like it's a really great resource for folks sometimes looking for internships or looking for particular skills, looking for.
Oh yeah, and sorry, the skills piece, we have some workshops. We have an intro to STATA workshop coming up late October, and we have an intro to R coming up in November. And sorry to interrupt, that's my last contribution there.
That's great. I think it's a good resource to know about. Sophie, how about you? What are you up to?
So I'm Sophie, and I am a fourth-year doctoral student. I admittedly don't totally understand these conversations, but I was kind of curious, and I really like Dr. Lentz, who is on my dissertation committee. I studied the implementation of health policies that address violence against women in developing countries, and my dissertation is focused on Mexico. So as I'm thinking about how my dissertation can kind of set me up for my career, I'm always curious to hear about kind of musings on different paths. So happy to be here.
Cool, welcome. And also Sophie got a really prestigious dissertation grant recently. So it's like, yay, Fulbright.
Thank you.
It's pretty awesome. She's like one of like 3 people at UT. It's totally a big honor, and speaks to the quality of her work for sure. Last but not least, there is someone in an olive green t-shirt who I don't know yet. And when you're muted, your mic doesn't, your name isn't next to it, at least on my screen. Brian, perfect.
Hello, my name is Brian. I'm a first-year MGPS student. I'm pretty new to the development sphere. I took a class in undergrad on world population and hunger, and that kind of opened me to the development world. I really loved the class, so just looking forward to learning more about the field. In general, some interests would be about food, and then also interested in climate change and how that will affect developing nations.
Awesome. This is great. This is a really diverse group of folks. And one thing that kind of comes to mind is, I think as people are thinking about careers, there's, especially in the development space, there's a real opportunity for thinking about like development and ... And so just as Olivia was indicating that she's thinking about development and monitoring and evaluation, or Brian's talking about development and perhaps, you know, climate change, like those are really, it's useful to have something that is, what was I say, an additional anchor kind of beyond just the field of development as you're thinking about career stuff. And the reason being is that because I think everybody is maybe not when I was doing my work, but certainly nowadays people recognize that development intersects with and is influenced by so many different things like climate change, and you know is so shaped by questions around, say, how do we evaluate a project, et cetera, that having that sort of that expertise in something else is really valuable and can kind of, if you're thinking from kind of a strategic career perspective, like it's really helpful to have like the development and so I have some colleagues who are convinced that like development economists won't get hired. They have to be development and something else economists. And that's just, I think, the way the way that the field is moving, because everybody recognizes the intersections of development with so many pieces that we haven't been paying attention to, but we ought to be. And, you know, climate change, of course, being a really big one, and, you know, thinking about program design and sort of on the more micro level around the evaluation space is another big one. So I don't have any real agenda. I can give you guys a really short like spiel, which I feel like some of you who I saw during camp or during orientation last year maybe got to hear from me before. But I think when I think about careers in terms of development, you know, I think there's this, like, for me, there's almost this nexus of kind of skills, passion, and needs, for lack of a better three words. And so it's like, what kind of skills do you want to bring to questions of development? Like, where does your passion lie? Perhaps it's topical, perhaps it's geographic, and where are the needs, right? Like, where are the sorts of questions that are getting asked? And so you could argue, like, arguably, we need to know a lot more about climate change and development and how they can interact than we do. Frankly, I just don't think we know that much. And so as you're thinking about where to position yourself in your job search, contemplating those three kind of buckets is really potentially helpful. And so something that I recommend for folks who are thinking about kind of job stuff, and folks maybe have heard this before, is I always suggest people go, actually I can put it into the chat. Go to this website DevX, which just has a list of different jobs, and to read those job descriptions, not necessarily with an eye towards applying for them, but with an eye towards seeing what's out there. And an eye towards seeing what the job descriptions look like, if that makes sense. And so you can see some of these jobs are going to be highly skill specific, like they're going to want nutritionists, and if you don't have a degree in nutrition, like you're kind of out of luck. And then some of them are going to be highly specific around like particular, like other types of skills, like grant writing or like monitoring evaluation or program design. And then others are going to be really focused on topics, right? Like we need someone who's an expert in, you know, thinking about, you know, like what is the intersection between public health and like, you know, sort of water and sanitary health with development, and how do we think about WASH broadly, right? And so some of these are kind of topical and some are going to be skill-based, and kind of knowing which of those interest you as you read them can kind of help you figure out what skills to build while you're in grad school, or kind of where to direct your search in some ways. So if you like keep coming back to the like, oh, I really want to work with, you know, migrant populations, and those are the jobs that you keep coming back to, then like figuring out what the skills are that people are looking for those jobs can kind of help you kind of in some ways reverse engineer to make sure you have those skills. And so that's something that I didn't do when I was working on my career, or like working towards my career, but I wish I had, because I think I would have kind of maybe taken slightly different courses, et cetera, to kind of think about other types of skills that would have been helpful at the time. So one of the other things that I would kind of argue about is thinking about in your kind of, as you're thinking about what are you passionate about, it's this question for me of like, what level of change do you want to be kind of working in, right? Like, do you want to be trying to address the needs, you know, sometimes the immediate needs of individuals and households? For example, you know, food aid, my work in food aid, a lot of it is like, all right, how do we more efficiently get food to hungry people? Like, that's not changing the structure of why people are hungry. That is not changing the, you know, unjust kind of trade policies that maybe are keeping small farmers impoverished in low-income countries, right? And so that's like only a very small slice of the problem, but it's very direct. And you could also see the value of saying, hey, I want to do advocacy work to change the kind of unfair trade policies around agriculture. Like, and that's what I think is most meaningful. The trick with that part is that's going to be a slower process, right? And so there's a little bit of a trade-off here. And that's something that I think is really dependent on your personality, right? Like, do you want to do stuff where you can kind of see something happen, but it might not be something super big? Or do you want to do something that's going to be super long-term, and it might not be successful for a really long time, but it might make a big impact if you can kind of make that happen? I don't know what the answer is. I try to do both, but that's kind of like, you know, but it's sort of different projects doing different things. But some people feel like the small stuff is just only sources of frustration because you're just not changing the system. And other people feel like changing the system is like fraught with challenges and would rather be able to like make a change on the ground immediately. And it's my, you know, like I think about this in terms of like, you know, my mom is a social worker, and so she's really helping individuals, but she's helping individuals who are, you know, completely left behind by social protection systems, by lack of adequate, you know, available health insurance, et cetera, et cetera. These are like larger systemic issues that she's not solving. And she's okay with that because she loves working with individuals. But for me, like, I think not thinking about those bigger system-wide problems would make me a little bit crazy. And so I'm gonna guess that because you all are in a policy school, you like thinking about systems, but that might not be true. And so I don't know if you all have thoughts on that, or if you all have a sense of where you all fall. Yeah, John.
Right, I have a question on this, Dr. Lentz. So I think that you kind of preempted my question a bit as to how do you get into this space, recognizing that basically all development logic is a bit fraught and imperfect, and you're working to change it at the same time you're trying to implement it for people's well-being. My question is, so within either space, advocacy or implementation, it seems like you have worked with very specific organizations, CARE, World Food Program, Catholic Relief Services, and those strike me as both the most prestigious organizations, some of the biggest organizations, and maybe your calculation for working with those organizations is impact, scale of impact. But I was wondering, I guess that's just my guess. So can you kind of tell us more about how you choose to work with an organization, what you're looking for? Do you try to match values, or are you just looking for the biggest impact?
That's a really hard question. Yeah, and so I think you're also touching on another challenge, right? Which is thinking about, do you want to be working with an organization who is working kind of from within the system, or one that's kind of trying to change the system, right? And so to give you an example, this is an imperfect example, but to give you an example, back in 2006, when I was working on my master's, or I guess I was kind of finishing up working on my master's thesis, CARE decided to think about stopping what was then called monetizing food aid. So I was taking food aid from the US, shipping it abroad, selling it abroad, and then using proceeds from those sales to do development work. And the thing about monetization is the CARE was getting kind of like 75 cents on the dollar. So it was losing, from like a cost efficiency perspective, it's losing taxpayer dollars to buy from the US, ship it abroad, and then sell it locally. So that wasn't so great. But then it also wasn't so great because it was suddenly flooding these markets with kind of random food from the US, potentially undermining the ability of local economies to kind of be more self-sufficient. Sometimes it was causing price disruptions nobody could really tell. It was just like, it was like a bananas idea that Congress came up with at some point as a way of supporting farmers in the US, which it didn't really work because it's a teeny tiny bit of the amount of food aid, the amount of food and kind of commercially traded, but then also trying to kind of basically get like kind of a 2-for-1, right? This is development money and ag support domestically. And like 2-for-1 policies don't really work that well in general. Like that's just kind of the way it goes. And so what ended up happening is CARE decided that they didn't want to participate in this kind of monetizing food aid because they felt like it was really undermining the work that they were doing. So they're trying to build up smallholder farmers, but they're flooding the market with cheap US food, right? And they're like, well, that seems like we're working at cross purposes here. And so they decided from the inside, like, okay, we're not going to monetize except under very particular circumstances anymore. And so they had this very, I think, interesting example of being a development agency trying to push for change in the US government, but the way that they did it was like, we're just not going to take it anymore. And, we are going to advocate as to why we shouldn't do this. And that was a really slow process. It's taken, like 15 years, and the amount of food aid monetized now is teeny tiny compared to what it used to be. But it took multiple administrations to figure out how to fund food security work not using monetized food aid. And so it's like a really, really slow process. And so the reason why I got involved with CARE was because of the work that they were doing, which fed into my, which like directly related to my master's thesis. But where was I going with that? But where I was going with that is that they were trying to do work from the inside, whereas other organizations were like, we're not touching this at all because it's kind of garbage. And like, they just were like, nope, we don't want any part of it. And so they had influence in a different kind of way. right? Where they were like, this stuff is just no good and we're not even gonna, we never used it and we never will, right? And so I think Oxfam is an example of that. And so this is a super long example, except to say that I think it's a real challenge to think about in the advocacy space. Is it better to kind of do this kind of very like incremental, slow change, or to try to push for big stuff, big changes, or to say at the beginning that this is totally garbage from the get-go? I think there's space for both, and I think there often needs to be both. But I will say that people in CARE's advocacy office said that they got a lot more, like members of Congress felt like their concerns were more legitimate because they had been doing it, right? And then they walked away from it. And so this is like a real challenge because Oxfam had been advocating all along that this was a bad idea, but they weren't getting that same kind of traction on this issue. And so I don't know what the right answer is. I mean, I tend to think that that there is room for both strategies. And I think sometimes in the US, I feel like there needs to be this like abundance and accumulation of different bits of evidence, like chipping away at bad ideas, because we seem to be kind of slow to like change bad ideas. But maybe I'm being deeply cynical before an election, I don't know. All of which is to say, John, is I don't have an answer at all, but I think it's a really worthwhile question to think about. Like, you know, do you want to try to do something that's going to be more, you know, not in your face isn't the right word, but you know, more direct versus something that's like a little bit slower and maybe more consensus building as opposed to elsewise. I don't know if I've answered I don't think I've answered your question, but it's one that I grapple with because it's like, you know, this idea is bananas, but like I still do research in the food aid realm, even though it's chock full of crazy ideas. And I like to think I'm making them less crazy, but not always. So I don't know. Yeah, that's a hard question. Do you have thoughts? Does anyone else have thoughts on kind of this tension that John's identifying around kind of working within or outside of systems to kind of try to push for change?
If I could just say quickly, it seems like we're treating the NGO space as its own sort of governance structure to change. So in a way, I feel like you're co-opting my question by saying that even in the implementation space, you are still advocating for changes in the way that programs are implemented towards what you think is like best practices. Would that be fair to say? It seems like you have really internalized the idea that you can have it both ways in your career.
Yeah, maybe I can't actually. It's a really tough question. I mean, I think I think there is space, right, for change internally and to improve programming. But I also think this is coming from a perspective of, you know, I started out working much less critically in the development space than maybe I am now. So folks who are taking international development with me kind of get to see that it's like, oh, we've got lots of questions about whether or not this is a good idea and what could make it better. But as a result of that, I have worked with a lot of folks who, I would say the most cynical people I know about development are people who work in the development field. And I mean that because they're coming in with kind of really open eyes about what's working and what's not working. But they've decided that they still want to work within that space because they think that there's still changes they can make in the system to make it better, and they can still serve people who need help, right? And that's like the real tension. I mean, I've been thinking about this a lot in the context of a book review I have not written, but I need to, which is there's a really good example of like what a tricky challenge this is with, do you guys know Doctors Without Borders? During the famine in Ethiopia in 1984, I believe it's 1984, they were witnessing the Ethiopian government forcibly move people around the country, and that was exacerbating the famine, right? And so this was, you know, very few famines. In fact, today, no famines are because of like droughts. You know, it's all politics and it's all governments falling down on the job, you know, and so famines are, some people have argued famine should be considered war crimes, right? And I would say that's not untrue, especially today. But so in the 1980s, MSF said, you know, we can't work in this space because the government is making it worse. And so us helping people who are dying of starvation is allowing the government to continue its bad behavior. Like, we're patching up the problems they've caused, right? And so they walked away. They got a huge amount of blowback from that decision, where a lot of other agencies were like, we have a humanitarian imperative to support and help these people, and we are not taking a political stance. Like, we're here to help people, full stop, you know, and there are people hungry and we're going to solve it, right? And I think that, to me, in some ways, that kind of essentializes some of the challenges of like, well, which organizations, like, what should MSF have done? Like, were they right? You know, should these other NGOs have stayed or gone? I don't know if we know the answer. I mean, people might have very specific ideas about where they fall. And I certainly don't know, given that choice. I think about it all the time of like, do I do work in countries with bad governments? You know, am I participating in propping up bad governments by helping them deliver food aid more efficiently? Like, it's a really hard question. I don't have an answer to any of it. You know, or at least I'm not like, I have my own answer, but I don't have an answer for everyone. Sorry, this has totally taken us into a really deep, dark space. Other thoughts or questions or comments? I feel like we've totally gone this way.
Yeah, Dr. Lentz, I did want to kind of try and get in on that. And I think it's such a good question that John asked, and a lot of us struggle with this. And I think a piece that also complicates it, and maybe this isn't going to help us get towards an answer, but maybe the point isn't to find an answer, but just to explore as much as we can here, is how willing how much the organization, especially from the evaluation perspective, that's where I'm coming at this from. Okay, all the groundwork laid. How much does the organization actually want you to do the work that you're doing, and how much do they just want to check off boxes? Because I know a lot of people have worked in evaluation in activist groups, or from like that side of the world, in government, and it seems like, even with my experience with the Open Government Partnership, which is an international organization focused on transparency, that some of the governments participating were very, very concerned about transparency, and they wanted someone to tell them the truth. But some of the governments just wanted to get through the evaluation process so they could say, we did this because if we do the evaluation piece, then we get our rubber stamp that says we're an open government. Whether or not they get a good grade or not, you know, they're still a partner in this organization. And so I think what complicates it for us sometimes is, you know, we are excited about the work and we really care and we want to go there and do something. And then so much just depends on either like an individual or an organizational culture. And so, like, for me, my struggle is trying to figure out like what organization to go work for, where I'm not just going to be a pawn in somebody's like already decided plan, and where I'm actually going to be able to do the work that like that is in, you know, my heart is in. So I don't know. I feel like you run into problems on the inside and on the outside. And I always wonder, like, how do you, before you even apply, how do you figure out which organizations are actually committed and which ones are just looking for a rubber stamp, you know? And I guess I'm also pretty cynical from a few experiences as well, and not trying to succumb to that and hoping this next, you know, 8 months I have left in graduate school won't, will help me keep that fire alive. But I appreciate the conversation.
No, absolutely. And so, okay, I want to talk about Raymond's question, but first I want to say two things. One is I want to say I put a super long cut and paste into the chat, which is a link for an upcoming panel on so this is for PhD students, but it might be useful in general on research, like using development economics research in a job. And so it's a bunch of panelists from different organizations talking about what they do day to day. It's free, and you know, with the caveat, it's going to be super development econ focused. It might be worth attending if you can. The other thing is, before we get to Raymond's question, I want to make Noura introduce herself too, just to say hi.
Sorry for, coming in late. I had a student that I needed, TA hours. My name is Noura Al-Hassan. I'm a fourth year PhD student. I'm focusing on environmental policies in Gulf monarchies. So right now I'm, preparing my dissertation proposal, and it's looking more qual than I thought. So yeah, I'm more about like research methods, qualitative research methods right now.
Awesome, that's great, welcome. So I want to come back to Raymond's question, which is, how do you know if folks really want change and if they're going to take your findings seriously, and how do you identify good organizational cultures? And I mean, so kind of going back, I guess, going back to this big picture John was asking, one question to think about, I guess, is whether or not when you read their website, if you're able to identify, like, what are their kind of frameworks like that they're working with. Do you know what I mean? And so to give you I'm trying to give you an example, but like Oxfam's, this is pretty straightforward, but Oxfam has much more of a rights-based approach than other big NGOs in the US. And so that potentially is useful. You know, Catholic Relief Services, I know this from as an insider, tends to focus a lot more on kind of like ag production. CARE tends to think a lot more about gender. And those are like not going to tell you about the organizational culture per se, but they can tell you at least a little bit about like the frameworks people are drawing on, and whether or not you align with those frameworks can be helpful. Does anyone else have other ideas on, I mean, there's obviously the one of like having an insider tell you what's helpful, but or like having a book study.
I tend to like check out who the board of directors, or like, yeah, like sometimes I think that's like where you can tell if it's more political or not, or like who's having a stake in it, I think.
Interesting. Yeah. Does anyone else have any other tips for trying to figure out organizational culture? It's a tough one. I mean, I definitely think getting other people's perspectives is helpful. I also feel like it's a little bit tricky because you can have a really great organizational culture with like a bad actor, or you can have a really meh organizational culture with an amazing boss, you know, and that makes all the difference. And so some of it is the kind of internal quality, you know, the internal dynamics even within the organizational culture can matter a lot too. You guys are asking really hard questions. You like ask me some math or something. So like what is is this the Zoom link, John, that you just put into the chat? Yeah, that's what I should have put in the first time. Sorry, everybody. But if you're interested, this might be useful because it has a little, I think there are going to be panelists from industry, from non-governmental organizations. I think there's some folks from international United Nations organizations, etc. So you kind of get different perspectives on what development means. And I think that can be really helpful also as you're navigating. Like we've been talking a lot about the NGO space, but there's lots and lots of other ways for development careers to happen. And I think thinking about government positions, thinking about donors and funders, thinking about for-profit institutions, right? So there's some for-profit organizations that sometimes can be really pleasant, for lack of a better word, to work in relative to NGOs, because they tend to have a much more clear, I mean, and this goes back to organizational question, they have a more clear like bottom line where they're, you know, it's like they're doing development, but they because they're going to be profit focused, they're for-profit firms, they tend to like just be a little bit less like a little, I would say arguably maybe a little bit more strategic, and that can be either really frustrating or that can be really satisfying. And so we've had a handful of LBJ graduates go on to work at places like, let me think of a couple, I'm trying to think of some names of them in case you're interested. Chemonics, APT, John Snow. These are all for-profit organizations that do a lot of development work. They oftentimes are getting grants from USAID either to evaluate other NGOs projects or to implement projects. But they have a very, I would say like a slightly less chaotic feel to them. And some people really like that. And so that's another kind of less known avenue for development work, I would argue. And then of course there are think tanks and stuff like that. And I think this comes back to these bigger questions of like, what kind of work do you want to be doing day to day? You know, like, do you want to be somebody in the field implementing projects? Do you want to be, you know, running a small, you know, essentially like running an office in a country, trying to run programs, etc. Do you want to be evaluating those programs? Do you want to be advocating for specific changes? Do you want to be writing grants to fund those programs, etc.? And there's lots and lots of different intervention points, and those I think can speak, that kind of goes back to this nexus of needs, passions, and skills, where it's like folks who are really, really great writers, like there's a desperate need for good grant writers. Whether or not you want to do that for the rest of your career is an open question, but it's a really great way to get a job. And ditto with evaluation, like the need for evaluators is huge. And you might not want to do that your whole career, but it's a really great way to get a handle on how things work in the field, you know, and kind of get a sense of like, okay, now I want to take that and move towards implementing changes or advocating for changes, etc. So I feel like that's not super helpful, but it's hard. Jobs are hard. Other thoughts, comments? I also feel like Zoom is hard. Zoom's killing me today.
Dr. Lentz.
Yeah.
So I kind of wanted to ask you about, you know, you got your graduate degree, your PhD in sociology, right? And so I had my undergrad degree in sociology, and I kind of wanted to know, how do you continue bringing that sociological lens and mindset to your classes and your policy work, and, you know, just how do you kind of integrate that? Because I don't want to completely abandon that while I get into LBJ and start working on my coursework and in public health as well. So I'm kind of curious about how you continue that in what you do now.
That's a really interesting question. And I would say maybe I'm not a great sociologist because I ended up in a policy school, right? So like I'm pulling, like I really enjoy pulling different threads of things together. And so I definitely think the strength in policy schools is figuring out how to bring a really rich and like perspective to problems that's not entirely going to be doctrinal, right? So you can imagine folks from economics have specific ways of answering problems. Folks from political science have specific ways, as do, you know, sociologists, although what those are in sociology is a little bit wiggly. But I think that what we hopefully are bringing as policy students and kind of policy interested people is to say like, okay, we can draw insights from all these different perspectives to unpack like, okay, what are the assumptions of this program? Or what do we need to assume in order to make this work? Like, let's not go in blind assuming that everyone's a rational actor, right? Because we sort of know that that's not really how the world works sometimes. Or like, let's not assume that, you know, we're going to lay out a policy and it's going to be implemented exactly the way we said it was because we believe that that's how policy works, right? Like, and I think that's something that I think, so, which is to my long answer, this is a long answer, saying that for sociology, because it's sort of a little bit like more theoretically wiggly, I think that that's a really valuable set of skills to bring to policy in general. Is like, even if you have ideas on how the world works, it's like you have to be incorporating or thinking about a bunch of different theories all at once, as opposed to doing something that's, when you have more doctrinal training, it's like you have to kind of undo that a little bit in a policy space. I don't know, like so I should say with full disclosure, I did a master's in economics. And when you hang out with a group of economists, this is a, so here's, okay, so this is like an example I go back to a lot in my own work. during the World Food Price crisis, I was at a meeting in Rome that was hosted by the World Food Program, and it was half nutritionists and half economists. All the nutritionists were like, we need to deliver food aid to people because we need to make sure they're eating exactly what they need to be eating to improve nutrition perfectly. All the economists were like, we need to give people cash because everybody needs more choice, right? And so like there's very different perspectives on like what people need and on the way to accomplish that. And it was entirely driven by kind of these disciplinary boundaries of saying like, well, all that matters is nutrition if you're a nutritionist. And for economists, it was like, all right, we just want more choice. And we're gonna trust people are gonna make the best choice possible. And you know, the reality is oftentimes something much muddier in the middle. Like we do want people to be nourished, but we also maybe don't want to be paternalistic about telling them what to eat. But like, how do you do that in a sort of on a kind of day-to-day policy space? I think that's where sociology is really helpful, is being like, all right, let's think about this from a structuralist perspective. Let's think about this from an individualistic perspective. Like, let's think about this from thinking about norms, etc. Like all those things I think are really useful for me, hopefully for you. And I think I make all my students think about it that way too, if I can. But it's my long answer. Other thoughts? Questions, comments? You don't have to talk about development stuff either. Yeah, Olivia.
Sorry, my dog might bark. I have kind of a self-serving question, but hopefully it is applicable to others. So thinking specifically about evaluation, it can kind of be hard to make sense of that space. So I feel like there are organizations dedicated specifically to M&E. There are like NGOs or other organizations that have in-house evaluation. Then there's like the consultant firms that you put in the chat, for example. And so I was kind of wondering in your experience, like what the strengths of each are and kind of how to navigate like which direction to take, or whether it's easy to kind of transfer from one to the next.
Well, that's a great question. I think this comes back to the skills thing, right? So if you become somebody who's an M&E expert, I think it's very easy to jump. And I would say most people who become evaluation experts do kind of go pretty easily across from being like the main contact person in an organization who's like, you know, the M&E boss, right? And then moving towards this firm where maybe you're actually doing a lot of evaluations of other organizations' projects, right? You're being that third-party evaluator. And that's very easy. So you're not going to get locked in if you do one or the other. That said, I think some of it depends on what kind of role you want to play. And so if you're the lone M&E person in a pretty large organization, like your job, I think, will probably be looking at other evaluation plans and saying like, okay, this one's okay, this one's not okay. You know, but you're not going to be the person running those evaluations in the field. They're going to get kind of contracted out because there's just not going to be enough of you to go around. If you're part of a firm that does primarily evaluations, like you're going to be designing surveys, you're going to be implementing them, you're going to be kind of running the evaluation itself. So you're going to get a lot more like of the hands-on bits. And so I think that that's one of the trade-offs. I do know, just thinking about this in terms of CARE, for example, like CARE has a monitoring, evaluation, and learning, I think it's called MEAL, kind of like group, but a lot of what they do is USAID requires outsiders to evaluate their projects. So a lot of what the MEAL folks are trying to do is make sure that they are kind of in compliance and make sure that they're getting kind of the monitoring piece done, but they're not doing much and then sometimes they're trying to say, hey, USAID is making us evaluate ABC, but we really care about D. And so they might go off and try and do D, or they might try to find researchers who can come help them do D. And so it's a little bit more of like a facilitation role than an actual like evaluation role. I think that would be my general sense on if you're in a group of evaluators, that's kind of a different group of folks. Like it's gonna be much more actual evaluation as opposed to something that's maybe a little bit more meta if you're like the evaluation point person where you're like gonna evaluate other people who are gonna evaluate for you or something. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's super helpful. Thank you.
And tell me if other folks think I'm off on that, if you guys have other insights. And say, Nora, it looked like you were like in agreement, but maybe I don't know.
Well, if you want to take one more question, feel free. You know, we're not going to cut anyone off. We have scheduled this until 1, and we know everyone's time is kind of precious right now. But anyone else have last thoughts or questions? All right. Well, thanks so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your time, Erin, and students. I mean, we've got some cool people at LBJ, don't we? Thanks so much. Next week, we'll be joined by Peniel Joseph. So if you're free around the lunch hour on Monday, please join us. But thanks again for Erin Lentz joining us. We really appreciate it.
No, my pleasure. Obviously, I'm around. I've got office hours. Come, I don't know, come hang out and Zoom with me, I guess. And hopefully one day we'll get to hang out in person soon. All right. All right, take care, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.